Working as a waitress at a Christmas party, the woman froze when she realized the millionaire was her husband who died 7 years ago. She approached, and the Parker household was unusually quiet that evening, except for the faint crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of carolers outside. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air, clinging to every corner of their modest home. Allison adjusted the ornaments on the slightly crooked Christmas tree, her fingers brushing against a delicate angel figurine that Connor had insisted on putting up last year. The ornament was fragile, much like the sense of normalcy she had tried so hard to rebuild for her family. "Mom, does this go here?" Mia's small voice broke the silence as she held up a glittering silver snowflake. Her eyes wide with innocent curiosity, Allison turned and smiled, a warmth that barely masked her fatigue. "That's perfect, sweetheart. Right at the top." Mia grinned. Her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the fire, and carefully hung the ornament near the star at the top of the tree. Connor, now 9 years old and growing far too quickly, was sprawled on the worn-out couch, fiddling with a half-finished puzzle, his brow furrowed in concentration, though he was fully aware of the conversation. "You always say that to Mia," he teased, shooting his sister a playful look. "She gets all the compliments." Allison chuckled and walked over, ruffling his unruly brown hair. "That's because she has excellent taste, you on the other hand." She paused dramatically, her eyes twinkling. "Well, let's just say you're a work in progress." Connor rolled his eyes, but the corner of his mouth twitched into a grin. "Thanks, Mom. Love you too. Always. Buddy," Allison whispered, her heart swelling with affection and a bittersweet ache. She looked at her children, their faces illuminated by the twinkling lights of the tree, and felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude mixed with sorrow. They were her whole world, the only thing that kept her anchored when the weight of the past threatened to pull her under. The warmth of the moment couldn't erase the cold shadow that loomed at the edges of her mind. Every Christmas carried that shadow with it, the absence of Tyler. 7 years had passed since the accident, and yet the pain still felt fresh, like an open wound that refused to heal. She could still remember the night the police knocked on her door. The somber faces, the carefully chosen words, the numbness that followed. Tyler was gone. His car had been found wrecked on a dark, icy road. No survivors. Just like that, the life she knew had been shattered beyond repair. "Mom." Mia's soft hand tugged at her sleeve, pulling her back to the present. "Are you okay?" Allison blinked, her eyes stinging. She forced a smile and knelt to pull Mia into a hug, her daughter's small arms wrapping around her neck. "I'm fine, honey. Just thinking about how lucky I am to have you two." Connor's gaze softened, the playful glint replaced by something more serious. "We're lucky to have you too, Mom, right, Mia?" Mia nodded vigorously, her pigtails bouncing. "Yeah, we love you more than anything." Allison's throat tightened, and she pressed a kiss to Mia's cheek. "I love you both more than anything, too." She straightened and took a deep breath, pushing the sorrow back into its corner. "Now, who's ready for some hot chocolate?" A chorus of excited cheers filled the room. The heaviness lifted. If only for a moment, Allison moved to the kitchen, pulling mugs from the cabinet and heating milk on the stove. The rhythmic clinking of spoons stirring marshmallows into the hot chocolate was oddly comforting. This was their tradition. Small, simple, but theirs. "Don't forget the whipped cream," Connor called, peeking over the counter. "I wouldn't dare," Allison replied, squeezing a fluffy swirl into each mug before handing them off. The kids settled back on the couch, their faces glowing with contentment as they sipped the steaming drinks. Allison sank into the armchair by the fireplace, her fingers curling around her own mug. The flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, and her gaze drifted to the mantel where framed photos stood like silent witnesses to a life that once was. There was one of Tyler holding a newborn Connor, his smile full of pride and joy. Another of the 4 of them together, their last Christmas as a family. Her fingers traced the edge of the frame, and a familiar ache settled in her chest. She hadn't had the heart to take those photos down, even though looking at them sometimes felt like pressing on a bruise when the kids finally drifted off to sleep. Allison stayed by the fire, the house wrapped in an almost sacred silence. The weight of the day finally pressed down on her shoulders. She wondered, not for the first time, if she was doing enough for them. If she was enough. "You're stronger than you think," her sister Jill had told her once. But you don't have to be strong all the time. But what choice did she have? Weakness wasn't an option when 2 little lives depended on her. As the clock inched closer to midnight, she stood and turned off the lights on the tree. The angel on top sparkled faintly in the dim light, a fragile symbol of hope. She whispered into the quiet, her voice trembling. I hope I'm doing okay. Ty, I hope I'm making you proud. But deep down, a darker question gnawed at her. Why did it never feel like he was really gone? The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the Parker home, casting a soft glow on the living room. The Christmas tree still twinkled with its colorful lights. The faint smell of pine and leftover cocoa lingering in the air. Allison stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing out the mugs from the night before. Her thoughts swirled as she absent-mindedly watched the water swirl down the drain. The sound of the mail slot clinking open broke her reverie. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door. Picking up the small pile of mail, bills, coupons, and an envelope from the kids' school, she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. December always seemed to stretch her thin, both financially and emotionally, as she shuffled through the envelopes. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find her neighbor and friend, Carla, standing there with a bright smile and a thermos in hand. Morning, Allison. Thought you might need a coffee refill, Carla said, extending the thermos. You're a lifesaver, Allison replied, taking the warm container gratefully. Come in for a minute. Carla stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over the cozy but worn living room. Tree looks great. The kids must be excited. They are, Allison said, her smile faint. They always are. I just wish. She trailed off, not finishing the sentence. Wishing didn't pay the bills. Carla tilted her head sympathetically. Something will come through, it always does. She paused and then brightened. Actually, that's why I stopped by. Remember my cousin Liz who works catering for those fancy Beverly Hills events? Allison nodded, curious. She called me last night. One of their regulars needs extra hands for a big Christmas gala tomorrow night. Pays really well, and they're desperate for staff. I told her I'd ask if you'd be interested. Allison blinked, the weight on her chest momentarily lifting. A job like that could mean buying the gifts Connor and Mia had been hinting at, maybe even a little cushion for January's rent. That sounds amazing, she said slowly, trying to keep the surge of hope from showing too plainly. Are you sure they'll take me on such short notice? They'll take anyone who can carry a tray and smile, Carla assured her. It's at some big shot's mansion. You'll be serving drinks, hors d'oeuvres, that kind of thing. The shift's long, but it's worth it. Allison took a deep breath. I'll do it. I'll tell Liz I'm in. Carla grinned. I knew you'd say yes. I'll text her right now. She said to dress in black and show up at the Hilton on Wilshire tomorrow afternoon. They'll shuttle everyone to the venue. Allison's mind buzzed with a mix of anxiety and relief. It had been years since she'd been anywhere near a high-end event, and the idea of walking into a mansion filled with the wealthy and privileged left her stomach in knots, but she couldn't afford to pass this up. Thanks, Carla, she said softly. I really appreciate it. Anytime, hun. Carla gave her a quick hug. Now go enjoy the rest of the day with those kids. After Carla left, Allison took a moment to lean against the door, the thermos warm in her hands. She felt a flicker of hope, small but persistent. Maybe this was the break she needed, a little light in what had felt like an endless tunnel. That afternoon, she took Connor and Mia to the park. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke. Connor raced ahead with a group of kids from the neighborhood, while Mia clung to Allison's hand, her eyes sparkling as they walked toward the swings. Push me, Mommy, Mia squealed as she scrambled onto the swing, her legs kicking excitedly. Allison smiled, positioning herself behind her daughter and giving the swing a gentle push. The laughter that bubbled out of Mia was pure and uninhibited, a sound that momentarily washed away the heaviness in Allison's chest as Mia swung higher, her giggles blending with the rustling of leaves. Allison's thoughts drifted to Tyler. He used to take them to this very park on weekends, his deep laugh echoing as he chased Connor around the playground. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the chilly air and pushing the memories away. Higher, Mommy. I want to touch the sky. Allison laughed softly. Okay, hold on tight. For those brief moments, everything felt almost normal. That night, after the kids were asleep, Allison stood in front of the small closet in her bedroom. She pulled out a simple black dress, one of the few things she'd kept from before. It was modest but elegant, a relic of a time when dressing up for a night out was part of her life. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her thoughts swirling with anticipation and nervousness. Tomorrow night, she would step into a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away from her own. But she reminded herself of the reason why she was doing this. For Connor, for Maya, for the chance to give them a Christmas they deserved. She hung the dress on the door and turned off the light, the faint glow of the street lamp outside casting shadows on the wall. As she lay in bed, the quiet hum of the night settled around her. A strange feeling fluttered in her chest, part hope, part dread, a whisper that something was about to change, whether it was for better or worse. She didn't know, but she would face it, just as she had faced everything else, head on, with no other choice. The winter sun had already started to dip behind the skyline when Allison arrived at the Hilton on Wilshire Boulevard. A cold wind nipped at her cheeks as she adjusted her black dress and smoothed her hair back into a neat bun. The lobby was bustling with other caterers, waitstaff, and event organizers, all dressed in black and white, their faces set in focused determination. "Allison Parker?" A woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard called out. Allison stepped forward, clutching her small purse tightly. "Yes, that's me." The woman gave her a brisk once-over and nodded. "Good. You'll be assigned to drink service. Follow the group outside. The shuttle's waiting." Allison joined a small cluster of workers as they filed out the glass doors into the evening chill. The van was already half full, the hum of quiet conversation inside mixing with the occasional burst of laughter. She slid into a seat by the window, her eyes fixed on the city lights flickering to life. "First time working one of these gigs?" a young man beside her asked, his voice friendly. She turned to find a smile on his face, his dark eyes warm and open. "Yeah, first time you." "Nah, I do this all the time. I do this all the..." "It's good money if you don't mind sore feet and rich people pretending you're invisible." He chuckled. "I'm Marco, by the way." Allison. "Well, Allison, don't worry. Stick with me, and you'll be fine." She managed a small smile, grateful for the kindness. The van pulled away from the curb and they rolled through the city, past twinkling decorations and crowded sidewalks. The chatter in the van faded as they entered a wealthy neighborhood where gates were tall, hedges were perfectly trimmed, and the air seemed colder somehow. The van finally stopped in front of an imposing mansion. The house was a symphony of grandeur, tall windows framed by ivy, golden lights spilling onto a circular driveway lined with luxury cars. A large, decorated wreath hung on the massive oak doors, twinkling with tiny white lights. "Showtime," Marco muttered, stretching his arms. "Ready? As I'll ever be," Allison replied, her stomach in knots. They climbed out of the van, the cold biting through her thin dress. A man in a sharp suit directed them through a side entrance, away from the grandeur of the main doors. The hallway they entered was a stark contrast to the outside world. Polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and an air of quiet opulence. "All right." "Everyone," the event manager barked. "This is a high-profile crowd. No mistakes, no lingering, and absolutely no fraternizing with the guests. Understood?" A chorus of "Yes, ma'am" echoed back. Allison took a deep breath as she picked up her tray of champagne flutes. The glasses clinked softly, a delicate, nerve-wracking sound. She followed the other servers into the main hall, her eyes widening as the space unfolded before her. The ballroom was breathtaking. Golden lights glittered from the massive chandelier overhead, casting warm hues onto the polished floors. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits drifted through the room, laughter and conversation swirling like an elegant dance. A live string quartet played in the corner, the notes floating gently through the air. She felt like an outsider peering into a world that wasn't hers. The wealth, the glamour, the effortless smiles. It was all so far removed from her reality. But she shook the feeling off, forcing her hands to steady as she balanced the tray. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself. "You're here for the money. That's it." She wove through the crowd, offering drinks and dodging the occasional dismissive wave. Most guests barely glanced at her, their eyes skimming over her like she was part of the decor. She found Marco across the room, giving her an encouraging thumbs up before disappearing behind a group of laughing socialites. As she passed near the grand staircase, she caught sight of herself in a gilded mirror. For a moment, She didn't recognize the woman staring back. The black dress, the tight bun, the mask of calm professionalism. It all felt like a costume, barely concealing the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. "Allison," a voice murmured. She blinked, realizing the voice had come from inside her head, but the sensation of hearing her name in that setting sent a chill up her spine. She shook it off and turned toward the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over the guests. That's when she saw him. At first, it was just the back of a man in a sharp charcoal suit, his broad shoulders and dark hair familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. He was standing near the fireplace, a drink in his hand, laughing at something someone said. The sound of his laughter, deep, rich, unmistakable, clawed its way into her memory. Her breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. The man turned slightly, his profile coming into view, and the tray in her hands trembled. The world around her dimmed, the chatter and music fading into a dull roar. Her knees felt weak, and for a moment, she thought she might drop the glasses. It was him, Tyler, alive. A cold wave of disbelief crashed over her, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the entire room could hear it. Her fingers gripped the tray tighter, knuckles white as she tried to breathe. The years of grief, the nights spent wondering, the crushing loneliness, all of it slammed into her at once. He wasn't dead. He was here, alive and well, in this world of money and privilege, and he was smiling like nothing had ever happened. She felt sick. Her mind screamed 1,000 questions, but only one rose to the surface, clear and sharp as a knife. How could he do this to us? The air seemed to thin around her. Allison's chest tightened as she stared at the man she once knew better than anyone, or thought she did. Tyler's profile was etched in her mind, every curve of his jaw, the slight crinkle around his eyes when he laughed. She had memorized those features in her grief, afraid that time would erode the image of him from her mind. And yet, there he was, in the flesh, smiling, breathing, alive. Her hands trembled, the tray of champagne flutes clinking softly in her grip. She clenched her jaw, forcing her legs to remain steady. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, but none of them made sense. How was this possible? Why was he here? Why hadn't he come back to us? Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She took a shaky breath, forcing her feet to move, one step forward, another. The space between them narrowed, yet it felt like an abyss. She weaved through the crowd, her vision tunneling until Tyler was the only thing in focus. Her fingers curled tighter around the tray, the glass stems digging into her skin. As she drew closer, Tyler turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the room. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. His laughter faded mid-sentence, his smile faltering. Confusion clouded his expression. And then, shock. Recognition flashed across his face like a lightning strike. His eyes widened, his body stiffening as if he'd seen a ghost. Allison's voice was a whisper, tight and raw. "Tyler." He blinked, his mouth opening slightly, but no sound came out. The color drained from his face, and for a moment they stood frozen in a bubble of stunned silence. Around them, the party continued. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of the string quartet, oblivious to the storm brewing in the center of the room. "Allison," he finally breathed, his voice barely audible. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes darting around as if he expected the floor to collapse beneath him. What are you doing here?" A sharp laugh escaped her lips, bitter and hollow. "What am I doing here?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "I'm working, Tyler. You know, surviving. Something I've had to do alone for the past 7 years." Tyler flinched, his face contorted with guilt. He glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Allison, I can explain." "Explain?" Her voice cracked, and tears burned at the corners of her eyes. "Explain how you're standing here, alive and well, while I spent 7 years thinking you were dead. Explain how you left me to raise our children alone." His eyes darted away at the mention of the kids. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Please, not here," he whispered urgently. "Can we go somewhere private? I'll tell you everything, I promise." She shook her head, the sheer audacity of his request igniting a fire inside her. "Private? You want to hide this conversation like you hid from us?" Her voice rose. drawing curious glances from a few guests nearby. She didn't care. The years of pain and confusion clawed their way to the surface, refusing to be suppressed any longer. "Allison, please." His voice cracked, desperation seeping into his eyes. He reached out a hand, but she stepped back, the gesture like a slap to her face. Her grip on the tray loosened, and suddenly, she didn't care about keeping up appearances. She set it down on a nearby table. Her hands finally freed a ball into fists at her sides. The tremor in her voice was gone now, replaced by a cold, hard edge. "Who are you, Tyler?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "Because the man I loved, the man I married, would never have done this. He would never have abandoned me. He would never have abandoned his children." Tyler's face crumbled, and for a split second, she saw the man she had once trusted with her whole heart. But the moment passed. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes landing on a woman in a glittering red dress across the room. The woman's gaze met his, and her expression tightened with concern. Allison's breath caught in her throat. "Is that her?" she asked, the question a dagger on her tongue. "Is she the reason you left us?" Tyler's jaw clenched, his silence answering for him. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, the air rushing from her lungs. The man she had mourned, the man she had spent nights crying for, had not only left her, he had replaced her. Her vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them away. She refused to cry in front of him. He didn't deserve her tears. "You're a coward," she whispered. "You didn't die, Tyler. You just ran away." "Allison." "No." She held up a hand, cutting him off. "You don't get to say my name. You don't get to ask for my understanding. Not after everything." She turned on her heel, her heart shattering with every step. She pushed through the crowd, her mind a whirlwind of rage and grief. The world spun around her, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had to get out, away from him, away from the lies. Her vision tunneled as she stumbled toward the side exit. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm inside her. She pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to breathe. 7 years of mourning, 7 years of questions. All of it had led to this nightmare. Behind her, the door creaked open. "Allison, wait!" Tyler's voice cracked in the night, but she didn't stop. She didn't look back. She was done waiting. The cold night air bit at Allison's skin as she stumbled away from the mansion, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The world outside was a blur of twinkling lights and muted holiday cheer, so at odds with the chaos raging inside her. Her shoes crunched on the gravel path, but she barely registered the sound. All she could hear was the echo of Tyler's voice, his feeble attempts at explanations, his hollow pleas. Her legs carried her forward with a mind of their own, desperate to put as much distance as possible between her and the lie she'd just uncovered. She stopped near a towering hedge, leaning against it for support. The neatly trimmed branches pressed into her back, grounding her in reality. She inhaled deeply, trying to slow her racing heart, but every breath felt like shards of glass scraping her lungs. "Allison," his voice, frantic and broken. Sliced through the night, she squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear. But his footsteps grew louder, and before she could move, he was there, standing a few feet away. The light from the mansion spilled onto his face, highlighting the lines etched by time and choices. He looked like a stranger wrapped in a familiar skin. "Allison, please," he rasped, his breath misting in the cold air. "I need you to listen to me." Her eyes snapped open, and she fixed him with a glare so sharp it felt like it could cut through steel. "Why should I listen to you, Tyler? 7 years. 7 years I thought you were dead. I buried you. I cried for you. Our children cried for you. And you were out here, living some new life." Her voice cracked, the anger fighting to hold back the sorrow. He winced as if each word was a slap. "It wasn't that simple. It never is with you, is it?" she snapped. "Nothing's ever simple enough to keep you from running away." He took a hesitant step forward, his hands outstretched, palms up. The gesture was painfully familiar, a relic from arguments long past, but it didn't work this time. "I didn't want this," he whispered, his voice hollow. "I thought I was protecting you, protecting me." Her laugh was bitter, sharp as a blade. "From what, Tyler?" "From the truth, from having a husband, from our children having a father. He looked away, shame darkening his features. I got in over my head. I was involved with people. Dangerous people. I made mistakes, Allison. Big ones when the deal went south, I thought. I thought the only way out was to disappear. I was afraid they'd come after you and the kids. Her heart twisted painfully, but she refused to let his words soften her. So, instead of facing it, you took the coward's way out. You let us think you were dead. You let your children grow up without a father. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. Damn right you were wrong. Her voice trembled with the weight of all the years she'd borne alone. Do you have any idea what you did to us? Connor barely remembers you. Mia asks me why her daddy isn't in heaven with the other angels. I had to explain to a 5-year-old why life isn't fair. Tyler's eyes glistened with tears, but they didn't move her. Not this time. I wanted to come back, he whispered, but every year that passed, it got harder. I didn't know how to fix it. You can't fix it, she said, her voice cold and firm. Some things are beyond repair. A painful silence stretched between them. The sound of distant laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the air, cruel reminders of a world that kept turning while hers had shattered. Who is she? The question slipped out before she could stop it, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman in the red dress. Is she part of this mess? Tyler's face tightened. Her name is Ashley, and she knows. Allison's jaw clenched. She knows you abandoned your family and decided to play dead. He nodded, the guilt etched deep into his features. She was part of it. She helped me disappear. Her stomach churned with disgust. The betrayal was complete, each piece falling into place like a nightmare puzzle. You didn't just leave us. Tyler, you replaced us. It wasn't like that, he pleaded. It was survival. Survival. Her voice rose, trembling with fury. I know all about survival, Tyler. I survived without you. We survived without you. You don't get to use that word. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away angrily. He didn't deserve to see her cry. You should have stayed dead, she whispered, her voice breaking. At least then, we could have held on to the memory of who you were. Now all I see is a lie. He reached for her again, but she stepped back. The distance between them now an unbridgeable chasm. Go back to your party. Tyler, go back to your new life. Her voice was steel. Because you sure as hell aren't welcome in mine. She turned on her heel, the cold air filling her lungs with each determined step. Behind her, she heard his choked sob, but she didn't stop. She didn't look back. She had 2 children waiting for her. They were the only truth she had left. The cold air gnawed at Allison's cheeks as she hurried down the long, winding driveway of the mansion. Her footsteps were quick and unsteady, fueled by a desperate need to escape, to put as much distance as possible between her and the painful reality she'd just faced. The echoes of her confrontation with Tyler replayed in her mind, each word a barb that dug deeper into her heart. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. The glittering lights of the party blurred behind her. Swallowed by the night, she barely noticed the few guests who gave her curious glances as she passed. Her vision narrowed, focused only on the iron gates ahead. If she could just get outside, maybe she could breathe again. Allison. Marco's voice cut through the chaos in her mind. She paused, her hands gripping the wrought iron bars of the gate, the cold metal biting into her palms. She turned slowly, blinking through the haze of tears. Marco jogged toward her, his brow furrowed with concern, his breath misting in the chilly air. Hey, what happened? He asked, his voice soft but urgent. You look like you've seen a ghost. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. I have. Marco's eyes searched her face, trying to understand. Do you need a ride home? You can't go back in there like this? She shook her head, the thought of returning to the mansion making her stomach twist. No, I need to get out of here. He hesitated, then nodded. Come on, my car's parked down the street. She followed him through the gate, her feet numb as they crunched over the gravel. The street beyond was dark and empty, a stark contrast to the golden glow of the mansion. Marco unlocked an old sedan, and she slipped into the passenger seat, the worn fabric of the seatbelt rough against her skin. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine as Marco started it. He glanced at her, his eyes cautious. You okay? She let out a shaky breath. No, not even close. He didn't press for details, and she was grateful for that. Instead, he pulled onto the road, the headlights slicing through the darkness. The city lights glimmered in the distance, a blur of motion and life that felt foreign and out of reach. They drove in silence, the radio playing a soft jazz tune that seemed wildly out of place. Allison stared out the window, the familiar streets of Los Angeles passing by like a dream. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories and questions she couldn't answer. Tyler was alive. The words felt surreal, like something out of a cruel fantasy. For years, she had mourned him, convinced that she'd failed to protect their children from the harsh reality of loss. She had grieved alone, cried in the dark when the kids were asleep, and forced herself to move forward because there was no other choice. But it had all been a lie. He hadn't died. He hadn't been taken from them. He had chosen to leave. A fresh wave of anger bubbled up, hot and fierce. But beneath it, a gnawing doubt began to fester. What if he was telling the truth? What if he really had been trying to protect them? Could there be a reason, a good reason for what he'd done? She shook her head. No, there was no justification for abandoning his family, for letting them suffer while he built a new life with someone else. Where do you want me to drop you? Marco asked gently. Allison blinked, realizing they were close to her neighborhood. Here's fine, she muttered. Pointing to the corner a block from her house, he pulled over and put the car in park. You sure you're going to be okay? She forced a tight smile. Yeah, thanks Marco for everything. He nodded, his eyes kind. Take care, Allison. She stepped out of the car, the cold air biting through the thin fabric of her dress. The familiar sight of her street brought a fleeting sense of comfort. The houses were quiet, their windows glowing softly with Christmas lights. She wrapped her arms around herself as she walked home, her thoughts a tangled mess. The porch light was on, just as she'd left it. She unlocked the door quietly, careful not to wake the kids. The warmth of the house wrapped around her like a fragile shield. She leaned against the door, closing her eyes for a moment, willing herself to hold it together. Allison, her sister Jill's voice startled her. Allison's eyes flew open to see Jill standing in the hallway, her expression a mix of relief and worry. Hey, Allison whispered. Sorry I'm late. Jill shook her head. Don't worry about it, the kids are asleep. She paused, studying Allison's face. What happened? Allison's lips trembled, and for the first time since she'd seen Tyler, the tears she'd been holding back spilled over. Jill was by her side in an instant, wrapping her in a hug. He's alive, Jill, Allison choked out. Tyler, he's alive. Jill froze, her arms tightening around Allison. What? Allison nodded, sobbing now, the dam breaking. He's alive. He left us. He lied. Jill's eyes blazed with fury. That son of a bitch! Allison's shoulders shook. I don't know what to do. The kids. How am I supposed to tell them? Jill pulled back, gripping Allison's shoulders. You don't have to figure it out tonight, right now. You need to rest. You need to breathe. Allison nodded weakly, the exhaustion crashing over her. Jill guided her to the couch, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself fall apart as she cried into her sister's shoulder. One thought haunted her. What if the truth was even worse than the lie? Allison woke to the soft hum of morning traffic filtering through the window. Sunlight streamed in through the thin curtains, casting patterns on the worn carpet. Her eyes felt gritty, her head heavy from the restless night. She blinked, trying to piece together the fragments of her shattered world. The couch cushion beneath her was still warm, the faint scent of Jill's perfume lingering in the air. Her sister must have stayed with her through the night, holding her as she cried herself empty. Now the house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. She forced herself to sit up, her muscles aching. The events of the previous night crashed back into her mind, each memory a jagged shard. Tyler, alive, the confrontation, the lies, the gut-wrenching betrayal. Her breath hitched, but she swallowed the sob threatening to rise. She couldn't afford to fall apart again. Not now. Footsteps padded softly down the hall, and Jill appeared in the doorway, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhaustion etched into her features, but her expression was resolute. Hey, Jill said softly, walking over and handing her the mug. How are you holding up? Allison took the coffee, the warmth seeping into her fingers. She stared into the dark liquid, her voice a hollow whisper. I don't know. Jill sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You don't have to know right now. One step at a time. Allison nodded, taking a careful sip. The bitterness grounded her, cutting through the fog in her mind. The kids. They're in the kitchen having breakfast. I told them you weren't feeling well. Jill paused. They're worried about you. Guilt twisted in her stomach. I need to be strong for them. You are strong, Jill insisted, her voice firm. But you don't have to do this alone. Whatever you decide to do about him, I'm here. We'll figure it out. Allison took a shaky breath. I have no idea what to do, Jill. Part of me wants to forget he exists, but another part, a stupid, broken part, wonders if there's more to the story. What if he really was trying to protect us? Jill's jaw tightened. Even if that's true, abandoning you and the kids wasn't the way to do it. He made his choice. Now you get to make yours. The words settled heavily in her chest. Jill was right, but the weight of the decision felt suffocating. Whatever she chose would shape not just her future, but Connor's and Mia's too. How could she possibly explain this to them? The sound of little feet pattering toward the living room interrupted her thoughts. Connor appeared first, his brown eyes wide with concern. Mia followed close behind, clutching her stuffed bunny, her lip trembling. Mommy, are you okay? Mia whispered. Allison set the coffee down and opened her arms. Her children rushed to her, their warmth a balm on her raw nerves. She held them tightly, pressing kisses to the tops of their heads. I'm okay, sweetheart, she murmured, though her voice cracked. I just needed some rest. Connor pulled back, his gaze searching her face. Did something bad happen? The innocence in his question nearly broke her. She glanced at Jill, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Something unexpected happened, Allison said carefully. But it's going to be okay. I promise. Mia snuggled closer, her small fingers gripping Allison's shirt. We love you, Mommy. I love you too. More than anything, she whispered, her voice thick. Jill cleared her throat. Hey, who wants pancakes? I make 'em almost as good as your mom. Mia's face lit up. Me? Connor managed a small smile. Okay, but you better not burn them, Jill laughed. No promises. As they disappeared back into the kitchen, Jill shot Allison a pointed look. We'll talk later. The message was clear. For now, the kids came first. Allison sat back, exhaling slowly. Her mind still spun with doubts and fears. But for the moment, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. Later that afternoon, after Jill had taken the kids to the park to give her some space, Allison found herself pacing the living room. The silence felt oppressive. Every time she closed her eyes, Tyler's face loomed behind her eyelids. The shock and guilt etched in his features. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting her out of her thoughts. She snatched it up, her heart pounding. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Her fingers hesitated before she answered. Hello? Allison? The voice was low, cautious, male. Who is this? Her breath caught in her throat. Detective Ramirez, I got your number from Jill. She said you might need some help. Her knees went weak with relief. She sank onto the couch. Yes, I do. She told me a bit about your situation. If what she says is true, you've got a lot more going on than a missing husband. This sounds like something we should look into. Allison's pulse quickened. You believe me. I've seen enough in my line of work to know that the truth is often stranger than fiction. If Tyler's alive and there's a chance he's involved in something illegal, we need to figure it out. For your safety and your kids. Tears welled in her eyes, a mix of gratitude and fear. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This could get complicated. But you're not alone in this, Allison. I promise. As she ended the call, a spark of determination ignited inside her. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't alone. For the first time since she'd seen Tyler, a plan began to form in her mind. She would uncover the truth, whatever it took. Allison stared at her phone long after the call with Detective Ramirez had ended. The weight of his words pressed on her shoulders. This could get complicated. She had no illusions that uncovering the truth about Tyler's disappearance and his new life would be easy. But for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of control, She stood and paced the living room, her mind buzzing with questions. Tyler had claimed he was protecting them, but from what? Who were the dangerous people he mentioned? And why had he resurfaced now, at that gala, so brazenly? The pieces didn't fit, and she was determined to force them into place. Her eyes fell on the family photo on the mantel. She picked it up, her fingers tracing Tyler's face. He looked so genuine in that picture, his arm wrapped around her, his smile bright with promises of a future they were supposed to build together. The lies made that smile feel like a slap to the face. She set the photo down, a spark of anger replacing her despair. She wasn't going to let Tyler's betrayal break her any further. She owed it to herself and her children to get answers. A knock at the door startled her. She wiped her hands on her jeans and took a steadying breath before opening it. Detective Ramirez stood there, his expression calm but serious. He was in his mid-40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a presence that radiated quiet authority. "Allison," he asked. She nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." He walked in, his eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. He seemed to take in every detail. The worn furniture, the toys scattered in the corner, the faint scent of cinnamon still lingering from the night before. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady. He nodded. "Your sister gave me the broad strokes, but I need to hear it from you. Start from the beginning." She gestured to the couch, and they sat. The words tumbled out in a rush. How Tyler had been declared dead in a car accident 7 years ago. How she'd seen him alive at the gala. The confrontation, and his cryptic explanations about a botched deal and dangerous people. Ramirez listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each detail. When she finished, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This is messy," he said, his tone thoughtful. If he's telling the truth about being involved with dangerous people, there could be more at play here than just a man abandoning his family. Allison's jaw tightened. He still made that choice. He still left us. "I know," Ramirez said gently. "But if he's tangled up with criminals, that means you and your kids could be in danger too." A chill ran down her spine. "Do you think they know about us?" "It's hard to say," Ramirez admitted, "but we can't take any chances. I'll look into Tyler's disappearance, see if I can find any record of a financial deal gone wrong or connections to known criminals. In the meantime, keep an eye out for anything unusual, people hanging around who shouldn't be, strange cars, anything." Allison nodded, her mind spinning. "What if Tyler tries to contact me again?" "Let me know immediately," Ramirez said. "We need to know what he's up to." A knock at the door interrupted them. Allison's heart leapt into her throat. Ramirez's eyes narrowed, and he stood, motioning for her to stay put. He walked to the door and peered through the peephole before relaxing slightly. "It's your sister." Relief flooded her, and Allison hurried to open the door. Jill stood there with Connor and Mia, their cheeks rosy from the cold, clutching half-eaten bags of popcorn. "Hey," Jill said, her eyes flicking to Ramirez. "Everything okay?" Allison forced a smile. "Yeah, come in." Connor and Mia darted inside, their chatter filling the air, blissfully unaware of the storm their mother was weathering. Jill followed them, her gaze still sharp with questions. "Detective Ramirez is helping us," Allison explained, her voice low. Jill nodded, her expression fierce. "Good. We need all the help we can get." Ramirez stood, his presence a steady anchor. "I'll start digging. Stay safe, Allison, and remember, you're not alone in this." She nodded, gratitude tightening her throat. "Thank you." He gave her a reassuring nod and left, the door clicking softly behind him. Jill turned to her, hands on her hips. "So, what's the next move?" Allison exhaled, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. "We find out what Tyler's hiding. No more lies. No more secrets." Jill's eyes shone with approval. "We'll get through this. You've got me, and now you've got Ramirez. Tyler doesn't stand a chance." A determined fire ignited in Allison's chest. For too long, she'd been at the mercy of Tyler's choices. Now, she was taking back control. She hugged her kids tightly, their warmth reminding her of what mattered most. No matter how tangled the web of lies became, she'd fight her way through it. For them, the next few days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Allison kept her routine as steady as she could for the kids. She made breakfast, packed lunches, and helped with homework, as if her world hadn't just been flipped on its head. But underneath the calm exterior, her thoughts churned endlessly. Every time the phone rang or a car slowed near the house, her heart would seize with dread. She watched the street carefully, noting every unfamiliar face, every vehicle that lingered just a second too long. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, her mind replaying the moment she saw Tyler at the gala over and over like a broken record. By the third day, the anxiety was wearing her thin. She sipped coffee in the kitchen, the bitter liquid doing little to clear the fog of exhaustion. The morning sun streamed through the window, but it did nothing to lift the dark cloud hanging over her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, making her jump. She snatched it up, her fingers trembling. It was a text from Detective Ramirez. "Meet me at the station in an hour. I found something." Her stomach flipped. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She glanced at the clock. Connor and Maya were at school, and Jill had offered to pick them up later. She had time. Grabbing her coat and keys, she left the house, her mind racing with possibilities. The police station was a squat, gray building that looked as tired as she felt. Allison stepped inside, the hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of voices adding to her sense of disorientation. She spotted Ramirez near the front desk. He waved her over, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for coming," he said, his tone clipped. "Come with me." He led her to a small, windowless office. The walls were lined with case files, and a single desk lamp cast long shadows across the room. He gestured for her to sit, then closed the door behind them. "I found something about Tyler," he said, sitting down across from her. His eyes were sharp, serious, and it's not good. Her mouth went dry. "What is it?" He slid a folder toward her. A few months before his death, Tyler was involved with a man named Vincent Marks. Marks is a financier. On paper, off the record, he launders money for some very dangerous people. Drug traffickers, arms dealers, you name it. Allison's hands shook as she opened the folder. A black and white photo of a man stared back at her. He had slicked back hair and cold, predatory eyes. Tyler was part of a deal that went sideways, Ramirez continued. He was supposed to help Marks move a large sum of money, but it disappeared. When it did, Tyler vanished too. We always thought Marks had him killed, but now it looks like Tyler faked his death to escape. She swallowed hard. And Marks, what happened to him? Ramirez's jaw tightened. He's still out there, and he doesn't like being played. If he finds out Tyler's alive, the implication hung heavy in the air. Marks wouldn't just come for Tyler. He'd come for anyone connected to him, including her and the kids. Panic surged through her. "We're in danger, aren't we?" Ramirez's eyes softened. "We don't know for sure, but we need to be careful. I've put a patrol on your street and I'll be checking in regularly. You're not alone in this, Allison." She nodded, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her thoughts darted to Connor and Mia, their innocent faces blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. "What do I do now?" she whispered. Ramirez leaned forward, his voice firm. "For now, you go home and stick to your routine. Don't let the kids know anything's wrong. I'll keep digging. If Tyler contacts you again, let me know immediately." She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. "Okay." He stood, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to figure this out. I promise." She wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at her insides. The world she'd built for her children was fragile, and she could feel it cracking beneath her feet. The drive home was a blur. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Every car behind her felt like a threat, every pedestrian a potential enemy. By the time she parked in front of her house, she was trembling. She sat in the car for a moment, trying to collect herself. The street was quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. The patrol car Ramirez had mentioned was parked a few houses down. The sight of it brought a small measure of comfort, but it wasn't enough to chase away the fear. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. As she walked up the steps, she noticed something unusual. The mail, normally stuffed into the mailbox, was strewn across the porch. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around, her eyes darting to the bushes and the street beyond. "Stay calm," she told herself. She bent down to gather the mail, her hands shaking. That's when she saw it. A single. unmarked envelope among the bills and junk mail. The paper was smooth and stark white, standing out against the rest. Her stomach twisted as she picked it up, her fingers trembling. She slipped her thumb under the flap and tore it open. A single sheet of paper slid out. The message was typed in bold. Black letters. "You can't hide the truth forever." A cold chill ran down her spine. She spun around, scanning the street, the houses, the windows. Everything looked the same, but she felt eyes on her, watching, waiting. Her heart hammered in her chest as she hurried inside and locked the door behind her. She leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The web of lies was tightening around her, and whoever was behind it was closing in. Allison's fingers gripped the envelope so tightly it crumpled in her hand. The words burned into her mind. "You can't hide the truth forever." The house felt too quiet, the walls pressing in around her. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to think. She needed to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. She glanced out the window. The patrol car was still parked a few houses down. Ramirez's team was watching, but the note had still made its way to her doorstep. Whoever left it was bold or desperate. Maybe both. She grabbed her phone and called Ramirez. He picked up on the second ring. "Allison?" His voice was sharp, alert. "There was a note," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone left a note on my porch." Silence then. "What does it say?" She read the message aloud, her hands shaking. It was typed. No name, no address, just those words. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice firm. "Don't open the door for anyone. Stay with the kids and keep the curtains closed." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay." She hung up and took a steadying breath. Her eyes drifted toward the clock on the wall. Jill would be bringing Connor and Mia home any minute. The thought of them walking into this nightmare made her stomach churn. The sound of tires crunching on gravel outside made her jump. She peeked through the curtain and exhaled shakily. It was Jill's car. She rushed to the door and opened it just as Jill stepped out with the kids. "Hey!" Jill called cheerfully, holding Mia's hand while Connor swung his backpack over his shoulder. "We're back." Allison forced a smile, her heart pounding. "Come inside. Quick." Jill's smile faltered. "What's wrong?" "Just get in. I'll explain." Jill's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. She herded the kids inside. Allison shut the door, locking it behind them. "Mom," Connor called, his face lighting up. "Guess what? I got an A on my science quiz." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, her voice tight. She kissed the top of his head, trying to mask her fear. "Why don't you two go play in your room for a bit?" "I need to talk to Aunt Jill." Connor's brow furrowed. "Are you okay, Mom?" She smiled weakly. "I'm fine. I just need a minute." "Okay. Okay." He grabbed Mia's hand, and they disappeared down the hallway. As soon as they were out of earshot, Jill turned to Allison. "What the hell is going on?" Allison handed her the crumpled envelope. Jill's face went pale as she read the note. "This was on your porch." She nodded. "Ramirez is on his way." Jill's eyes blazed. "Someone's threatening you. Do you think it's Tyler?" "I don't know," Allison whispered, her voice breaking. "But whoever it is, they know something, and they're not going to stop." Before Jill could respond, there was a firm knock at the door. Allison's heart leapt into her throat. Jill stepped protectively in front of her, her jaw tight. "It's Ramirez," a voice called from the other side. Jill exhaled sharply and opened the door. Detective Ramirez walked in, his expression grim. 2 uniformed officers followed him, scanning the room with trained eyes. "Where's the note?" Ramirez asked. Allison handed it over, her fingers still trembling. He examined it, his brow furrowed. "Whoever left this wanted you to feel vulnerable," he said, his voice steady. "They wanted you to know they're watching." Allison swallowed hard. "Does this mean they know about the kids?" Ramirez's jaw clenched. "We can't rule it out, but we're going to increase patrols in the area. I'll have someone stationed outside your house 24/7. Jill crossed her arms, her face flushed with anger. "That's not enough. What if they break in? What if they try to take the kids?" Ramirez's eyes softened. "I understand your fear, but right now we don't have enough to go on. The best thing you can do is stay vigilant. Lock the doors. Don't go anywhere alone. And call me the second anything seems off." Allison nodded, fighting the rising tide of panic. What about Tyler? Should I try to find him? Ramirez shook his head. No, let me handle that. Whoever's after him is dangerous. If they think you're looking for him, it could put you and the kids in more danger. She bit her lip, the frustration bubbling up. So I just wait. For now, yes, he said gently. But you're not powerless, Allison. You're smart, and you've made it this far. Trust me, we'll get through this. His words were meant to comfort, but the knot in her chest refused to loosen. She watched as the officers swept through the house, checking windows and doors, before setting up a post outside. When they finally left, the house felt both safer and more suffocating. The curtains were drawn tight, the doors bolted, but the sense of vulnerability lingered like a poison. Jill turned to her, her eyes blazing with determination. You're not going through this alone. I'm staying here. We'll protect the kids together. Allison nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you. Jill hugged her tightly, her voice fierce. We've survived worse. We can survive this too. As they pulled apart, Allison's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Her heart pounded. She hesitated, then answered, Hello. A distorted voice crackled through the line, cold and menacing. Stop digging. Allison, or you'll regret it. The line went dead. She stared at the phone, her hands trembling. The trap was closing in, and she was running out of time. Allison's hand shook as she set the phone down, the distorted voice still echoing in her mind. Stop digging, Allison, or you'll regret it. The cold finality of the threat wrapped around her like a vice. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, but the air felt thin, like she couldn't get enough of it. Jill's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. Who was that? What did they say? Allison swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. They told me to stop digging or I'll regret it. Jill's face went pale, but her expression hardened. We need to tell Ramirez. Allison nodded, her mind racing. I will. But what if telling him makes things worse? What if whoever this is gets more aggressive? More aggressive. Jill's voice rose. They're already threatening you, Allison. They know where you live. This isn't going to stop unless we do something. Her sister's anger matched the storm inside her, but fear was the loudest voice in her mind. I can't put the kids in danger, Jill. I can't let them get hurt because of Tyler's mess. Jill clenched her fists. Then what's the alternative? Living in fear until they decide to make good on their threat. Allison closed her eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. Every choice felt like stepping onto thin ice. One wrong move away from catastrophe. Her thoughts darted to Connor and Maya, blissfully unaware in their bedroom. Safe for now. For now. A knock at the door made them both jump. Jill rushed to the window and peeked through the curtains. It's Ramirez. Allison let out a shaky breath and opened the door. Ramirez stepped inside, his face tense. He took one look at Allison and knew something was wrong. What happened? He asked, his voice low. She held out the phone. I got a call. They told me to stop digging. Or else. Ramirez's jaw tightened. He took the phone, examining the screen. Blocked number. They're covering their tracks. He looked up, his eyes blazing with determination. This changes things. They're getting bolder. Allison's knees felt weak. She sank onto the couch, her fingers gripping the armrest like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. What do we do? We're not backing down, Ramirez said firmly. But we need to be smart. I'm going to have someone analyze this call, see if we can trace it. And I'm putting a team on you and the kids around the clock. You won't be alone for a second. Jill crossed her arms. What about Tyler? He's the reason this is happening. Can't you find him and... I don't know. Use him to stop this. Ramirez's face darkened. We're trying, but Tyler knows how to disappear. He's been doing it for years. If he doesn't want to be found, it's going to take time. Time we don't have, Allison said, her voice hollow. Whoever this is, they're closing in. Ramirez knelt in front of her, his voice softer now. I know you're scared, but I promise you, we're going to keep you and the kids safe. I won't let anything happen to you. A tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away, frustrated with herself for showing weakness. I just want this to be over. We'll get there, Ramirez assured her. One step at a time. That night, after the kids were in bed and Jill had fallen asleep on the couch, Allison sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flickering candle in front of her. The shadows danced across the walls, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and exhaustion. She thought about Tyler, the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart and their children's futures, the man who had shattered that trust into pieces so small she wasn't sure it could ever be put back together. A part of her still wanted to believe there was a reason, a shred of justification for what he had done, but the reality was far harsher. His choices had led them here, to this terrifying precipice, and she was left to pick up the pieces. The faint creak of a floorboard jolted her from her thoughts. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest. Connor stood in the doorway, his eyes wide and sleepy. "Mom." She forced a smile, pushing the fear down. "Hey, buddy, what are you doing up?" He shuffled over, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. "I had a bad dream." Her heart ached. She scooped him up, holding him close. "It's okay, you're safe." He buried his face in her shoulder. "I dreamed someone was chasing us." Her throat tightened. "No one's going to hurt us. I promise." He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. "You're scared too, aren't you?" She hesitated, the truth like a stone in her chest. "Yeah, a little. But being scared doesn't mean we aren't strong, and we're going to get through this, together." Connor nodded, his small hands gripping her shirt tightly. "I trust you, Mom." Her eyes welled with tears, but she smiled. "I love you, buddy. I love you too." She held him until his breathing slowed, his weight going limp in her arms. She carried him back to his bed and tucked him in, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead as she closed his door softly. She made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would protect them. She would face the darkness head-on, because her children deserved to live without fear. And if that meant confronting Tyler and the demons he'd unleashed, then so be it. The trap might be closing, but she refused to let it snap shut without a fight. The morning light was thin and pale, seeping through the curtains like a reluctant visitor. Allison's eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she couldn't afford to stop. The coffee in her hands was lukewarm, forgotten as she stared at the front door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Her nerves felt like frayed wires. Ready to snap, Jill entered the kitchen, her hair tousled and eyes lined with worry. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching Allison carefully. "Did you sleep at all?" Jill asked softly. Allison shook her head. "Couldn't. Every noise feels like a threat." Jill sighed. "This isn't sustainable. You can't keep going like this, Allison. It's going to break you." Allison's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice. If I break, what happens to Connor and Mia? You don't have to carry this alone. Ramirez is doing everything he can. Let him help." Allison stared into her coffee, her reflection rippling in the dark liquid. "It's not enough, Jill. They're getting closer. I can feel it." Before Jill could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Both women froze. The air seemed to solidify, trapping them in place. The knock came again, louder this time. "Allison, it's Ramirez." Relief flooded through her. Making her legs weak, she rushed to open the door. Detective Ramirez stood on the porch, his expression grim, a manila folder clutched in his hand. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside, and he entered, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "We need to talk." They sat at the kitchen table. Jill hovered nearby, her arms crossed, as if bracing for impact. Ramirez slid the folder toward Allison. "We traced the call you got. It was rerouted through several networks, but we managed to narrow it down to a burner phone. The location pinged near a warehouse district downtown." Allison's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Do you think it's Tyler?" Ramirez hesitated, his jaw working. "Maybe, or it could be someone connected to him. Either way, it's a lead." A spark of hope flared in her chest. "So we can find out who's behind this." "We're going to try," Ramirez said. "But I need you to stay put. It's too dangerous for you to get involved." Allison's hands clenched into fists. "I can't just sit here and do nothing." "You have to," he said, his voice firm. "Your job is to protect your kids. Let us handle the rest." Before she could argue, her phone buzzed on the table. Her heart leapt into her throat. The screen flashed with another blocked number. Ramirez's eyes narrowed, and he nodded for her to answer. She took a deep breath and pressed the call button. "Hello." A voice crackled through the line. Low, cold, and unmistakably male. "You didn't listen, Allison." Her blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "You had your chance to walk away," the voice continued. "Now, it's too late." The line went dead. Her hand shook as she lowered the phone. Ramirez grabbed it, his face hard with fury. "We'll trace it, don't worry." But worry was all she could do. The threat hung in the air like a noose, tightening with every passing second. "What do they want?" she whispered. Ramirez stood, his shoulders tense. "They want to scare you, and it's working." Jill stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "We need to get out of here. Take the kids somewhere safe." Allison shook her head. "We can't run. They'll find us no matter where we go. The only way to end this is to face it." Jill's eyes widened. "Are you serious? You want to face them?" Allison's voice was low, steady. "I don't want to. But what choice do we have if we run? We'll be looking over our shoulders forever. I can't live like that. The kids can't live like that." Ramirez nodded reluctantly. "You're right. But we do this my way. You stay here with an officer on guard. I'll check out the warehouse. If Tyler's there, we'll bring him in." Allison's stomach twisted. The idea of Tyler being so close, yet so unreachable, made her feel sick. "What if it's not Tyler? Then we deal with whoever it is," Ramirez said. "And we end this." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Allison called out, "Ramirez!" He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling. He gave her a grim smile. Always. As the door closed behind him, the weight of the situation settled heavily on her chest. Jill put a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing the right thing." Allison nodded, but doubt gnawed at her. Every choice felt like a gamble, and the stakes were her children's lives. She closed her eyes, trying to steady the storm inside her. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Each second stretched, the waiting almost unbearable. She thought of Connor and Maya, playing in their room, blissfully unaware of the danger closing in. Her phone buzzed again, making her jump. A text this time. "I warned you, Allison. Now you'll pay the price." Her breath caught. Her hands went cold. She rushed to the window, her eyes scanning the street. The patrol car was still there, but dread settled in her gut like a stone. A sudden crash echoed from the kids' room. "Mom!" Connor screamed. Allison's heart stopped. She bolted down the hallway, Jill close behind. The door to the kids' room was wide open, the window shattered, cold air rushing in. Connor stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. Mia was gone. "No!" Allison's scream tore through the air, raw and desperate. She stumbled into the room, her eyes darting frantically. Shards of glass glittered on the floor, cold air whipping through the broken window. Connor stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes locked on the empty space where Mia had just been. Her baby girl was gone. "Mom." Connor's voice was small, shaking. "They took her. They took Maya." Allison dropped to her knees, grabbing Connor's shoulders, her fingers trembling. "Did you see them? Did you see who took her?" He shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. "There was a man. He broke the window." He grabbed her and climbed out. A wave of nausea crashed over her, her vision blurring with panic. She pulled Connor close, her heart hammering in her chest. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Jill burst into the room, her eyes wild. "What happened? Oh my God. Where's Maya?" "They took her," Allison choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "They took my baby." Jill's face contorted with rage and fear. "We have to call Ramirez." Allison's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. She hit Ramirez's number, the call connecting immediately. "Allison." His voice was tense. "They took Mia," she sobbed. "They broke into the house and took her." A sharp intake of breath. "We're on our way. Stay calm. Lock the doors and don't let anyone in. We'll find her." She hung up, the words "stay calm" echoing in her head like a cruel joke. How could she stay calm when her daughter was out there, terrified and alone? Jill grabbed her arm, her grip firm. "We'll get her back, Allison. Ramirez will find her." But what if they were too late? The thought clawed at her, a dark and unrelenting fear. She wiped her face, pulling herself together. She couldn't fall apart now. Mia needed her to be strong. Connor clung to her. his small body shaking. "Is Mia gonna be okay?" Allison kissed his forehead, her voice shaking. "Yes, baby. We're going to get her back." Her mind raced through possibilities. Tyler, the threats, the shadowy figures lurking just beyond her understanding. It all led back to him. Whoever had taken Mia was connected to Tyler's past, and the only way to save her daughter was to confront that past head-on. She couldn't wait for Ramirez. She had to act now. 15 minutes later, Allison stood outside the warehouse district Ramirez had mentioned. Jill had insisted on coming, and Connor was left with the officer stationed outside the house. The cold wind whipped through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of rust and decay. Abandoned buildings loomed around them, their windows shattered, their walls covered in graffiti. "This is crazy," Jill whispered, her eyes darting around. "We should be waiting for the police." "They'll be here," Allison said, her jaw tight. "But I'm not waiting. I can't." She clenched the note in her hand, the last threat she'd received. The words were burned into her mind. "You can't hide the truth forever." Whoever had sent it thought they had the upper hand. They thought fear would keep her from fighting back. They were wrong. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. Every shadow felt alive, every sound amplified. Her heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline surging through her veins. She couldn't let fear paralyze her. Mia's life depended on it. Jill kept close to her side. "How do we even know where to look?" Allison's eyes scanned the buildings. One stood out, a crumbling structure with a chain-link fence partially torn down. The windows were dark, but something about it felt wrong. A chill ran down her spine. "That one," she whispered, pointing. Jill's face was pale, but she nodded. "Let's go." They slipped through the gap in the fence, the metal rattling softly. Allison's breath came in short, sharp bursts. Her palms were sweaty, but she wiped them on her jeans, forcing herself to stay focused. As they approached the building, a faint sound reached her ears. A muffled cry. Her heart clenched. "Mia." She bolted toward the sound. Jill right behind her. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. Allison pushed it open, her breath catching as she stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, the floor littered with debris. "Mommy!" Mia's terrified voice pierced the silence. Allison's eyes darted around, landing on a figure in the shadows. A man, holding Mia tightly, a hand clamped over her mouth. Her daughter's eyes were wide with terror, her small body trembling. "Let her go." Allison's voice shook with fury. The man stepped forward into the dim light. His face was hard, cruel, his eyes glinting with malice. "You shouldn't have come." "Allison, let her go," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "Take me instead. Just let her go." He laughed, the sound hollow and chilling. "It's too late for bargaining." Allison's heart pounded, her mind racing. She had no weapon, no plan, but she had to do something. Suddenly a shout echoed from outside. Flashlights swept through the darkness, beams cutting through the shadows. "Police, drop your weapon." The man's eyes widened in panic. He shoved Maya away and bolted for the back door. Allison lunged forward, catching Maya in her arms, clutching her daughter so tightly she could feel her heartbeat against her chest. "Mia, baby, I've got you. I've got you," she sobbed. Jill grabbed them both, her arms shaking. Ramirez stormed in, his gun drawn, his face fierce. "Are you okay?" he barked. Allison nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We're okay! We're okay!" The sound of sirens filled the air, but all Allison could hear was the steady thud of Maya's heartbeat. For now, that was enough. Allison's hands trembled as she clutched Mia to her chest. Her daughter's small fingers dug into her shirt, her sobs muffled against Allison's shoulder. The world around them, the flashing lights, the shouting officers, the chaos, blurred into insignificance. All that mattered was the warmth of Mia's body, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against her own. Ramirez's voice cut through the haze. "We need to get you both out of here. It's not safe yet." Jill nodded, her face pale but determined. "Come on, let's go." Allison followed them outside, her legs shaking with every step. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but it wasn't enough to clear the fog of fear and adrenaline clouding her mind. She stumbled toward one of the police cruisers, Ramirez holding the door open. "Get in," he urged. She slid into the back seat, her arms still wrapped tightly around Maya. Jill climbed in beside her, pulling the door shut with a decisive thud. The car's interior was warm, a stark contrast to the icy dread still gnawing at her insides. Ramirez leaned in through the open window, his face etched with exhaustion. "We're taking you to a safe house," he said. "You'll stay there until we figure out who's behind this." Allison's jaw clenched. "It's Tyler, it has to be. He's the reason all of this is happening." Ramirez nodded. "Maybe, but we need proof, and until we have it, you need to stay off the grid." She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I can't keep running, Ramirez. I need to end this." "We will end this," he said firmly. "But you can't do it alone." She met his eyes, the weight of the past 7 years pressing down on her shoulders. "I'm tired of feeling powerless." He gave her a small, grim smile. "That's exactly why we're going to stop this. Trust me." She nodded, her fingers brushing Mia's hair as her daughter's breathing began to slow. The exhaustion was finally catching up with her, her body craving rest even as her mind screamed for answers. Jill wrapped an arm around her shoulders, her voice soft. "We'll figure it out, Allie, one way or another." The safe house was a modest, nondescript bungalow, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Ramirez led them inside, the door closing with a solid finality. The living room was sparsely furnished, a couch, a coffee table, and heavy curtains drawn tightly over the windows. It was safe, but it felt like a prison. "You're secure here," Ramirez said, his voice low. "There's an officer stationed outside. No one gets in or out without my say-so." Allison nodded, the weight in her chest growing heavier. "Thank you. I'll be in touch," he promised. "Rest if you can." He left, the sound of the door locking behind him echoing in the silence. Jill turned to Allison, her face lined with worry. "You should get some sleep," she said. "I'll stay up and keep watch." Allison shook her head. "I can't. Not until I know Mia's okay." Jill sighed. "She's strong, just like her mom. She'll be okay." Allison knelt beside the couch where Mia was curled up under a blanket, her thumb tucked into her mouth. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. A wave of fierce love and protectiveness surged through her, mingling with the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. This has to end. Hours later, after Jill had finally convinced her to lie down, Allison drifted into a fitful sleep. Images swirled in her mind. Tyler's face at the gala, the shattered window, Mia's terrified eyes. A voice echoed through the chaos, low and cold. "Stop digging, Allison, or you'll regret it." She jolted awake, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light a faint glow seeping through the curtains. She glanced at the clock. 3:27 a.m. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She swung her legs off the couch and stood, her body heavy with exhaustion. Jill was asleep in the armchair, her head resting on her hand. Allison tiptoed to the kitchen, needing something, anything, to ground her as she poured a glass of water. Her phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lit up with a blocked number. Her breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, but she couldn't. With shaking fingers, she answered. "Allison." The voice was distorted, but she recognized the cadence, the underlying tone. "Tyler." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice cracking. "I never wanted you or the kids to get hurt." "Then stop it," she hissed. "Stop this madness before it's too late. It's out of my hands now," he said. "I made mistakes, Allison. I thought I could fix them, but they're closing in on me, too." "Where are you?" she demanded. "Tell me where you are, and we can end this together." A long silence stretched between them. She could hear his ragged breathing, the hesitation in his pause. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "but you need to stop looking for me. They'll never stop if you don't." "Who are they?" she begged. "Tyler, please." But the line went dead. She stared at the phone, her body trembling. Anger and frustration burned through her, hot and bitter. He was running again, leaving her to clean up the wreckage. But she was done waiting. She turned, her eyes blazing with determination. Jill was awake now, watching her warily. "What happened?" Jill asked. Allison's voice was cold, hard. I'm going to find him, and this time I'm not stopping until I do. Jill's eyes widened. Allie, you can't. I have to, she said, her voice resolute. For Mia, for Connor, for all of us. The trap was closing in, but she was done playing the prey. Allison's resolve crystallized with every beat of her heart. Fear had been her constant companion for too long, but it wouldn't control her now. She glanced at Jill, whose face was tight with worry. Allie, think this through, Jill said, her voice low. You can't just go out there and find him. Ramirez said it's dangerous. I don't care, Allison snapped, the anger in her voice surprising even herself. He called me. He knows where we are. As long as he's out there, we're never going to be safe. Jill's shoulders slumped, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. Allison shook her head. I have to do this, Jill. I can't live like this anymore. I need answers. Before Jill could argue, the door creaked open, and Detective Ramirez stepped inside. His face was grim, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. You're awake, he said, glancing between the two sisters. We have a lead. Allison's breath caught. Where? Ramirez hesitated. We traced the burner phone to an abandoned hotel downtown. We think Tyler might be holed up there. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Then that's where I'm going. Ramirez's jaw clenched. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. We'll handle it. Allison stepped forward, her eyes blazing. I need to be there. I need to face him. He's the reason this is happening. He owes me the truth. Ramirez studied her for a long moment, then sighed. You won't back down, will you? No. He nodded reluctantly. All right, but you stay close to me. No heroics. Jill grabbed Allison's hand. Be careful. Allison squeezed her sister's fingers. I will. The ride to the hotel was silent. The air in the car thick with tension. The city passed by in a blur of neon lights and dark alleyways. The glow of early dawn just starting to lighten the sky. Allison's heart pounded in her chest, a steady drumbeat of determination and dread. The hotel loomed ahead, a relic of forgotten times. Its facade was crumbling, the windows dark and vacant. The once grand sign now hung crookedly, its letters faded and chipped. The building seemed to exhale despair. Ramirez parked the car a block away, his eyes scanning the area. Stay behind me. We don't know what we're walking into. Allison nodded, her fingers clenching and unclenching at her sides. The wind cut through her coat, but she barely felt it. Her focus was razor sharp, every nerve on edge. They moved toward the entrance, their footsteps muffled by the debris-strewn sidewalk. Ramirez drew his gun, his body tense. The door was ajar, hanging off one hinge. He pushed it open with the barrel of his gun, the creaking sound echoing through the empty lobby. The interior was dark and musty, the air heavy with dust and neglect. Peeling wallpaper curled away from the walls like dead leaves. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. Stay close, Ramirez murmured. Allison followed him, her breath shallow. Every shadow felt alive, every sound a potential threat. They moved down a hallway lined with cracked doors, the dim light filtering through shattered windows, casting eerie patterns on the walls. A faint noise stopped them, a creaking floorboard, barely audible. Ramirez held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He moved forward, peering around the corner. Allison's heart leapt into her throat when she heard Ramirez's voice, low and firm. Freeze! Don't move! She stepped forward and saw him. Tyler. He was standing at the end of the hallway, his hands raised, his face gaunt and haunted. He looked so much older, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes hollow. Allison, he whispered, his voice cracking. Rage surged through her, drowning out the fear. How could you? She hissed. How could you put us through this? He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to Ramirez. I didn't have a choice. Bullshit. Her voice trembled with fury. You always had a choice, and you chose to leave us. His face contorted with pain. I was trying to protect you. Protect us. Her laughter was bitter, sharp. You call this protection. Mia was kidnapped because of you. He flinched as if she'd slapped him. I didn't know it would get this far. I thought if I stayed away, they'd leave you alone. Well, you thought wrong, Ramirez snapped. You've put your entire family in danger. Tyler's shoulders sagged. I know, and I'm sorry, but it's too late for apologies. Allison took a shaky breath, tears burning her eyes. Why did you call me Tyler? Why now? He looked at her, his eyes brimming with regret. Because I can't run anymore. They're closing in on me. I didn't want you to get caught in the crossfire. Who are they? Ramirez pressed. Tyler's gaze flicked over his shoulder, fear etched into his features. Vincent Marks and his men. They know I took the money. They want revenge. Ramirez's jaw tightened. Where's the money now? Tyler shook his head. Gone. I spent years hiding it, trying to buy time, but it wasn't enough. A sudden noise echoed through the building. Footsteps, fast and heavy. Tyler's eyes went wide. They're here. Ramirez spun around. We need to move now. Gunshots erupted, the sound deafening in the narrow hallway. Tyler grabbed Allison's arm, pulling her behind him as they ran for the back exit. Ramirez returned fire, his jaw clenched with determination. Allison, go! He shouted. They burst through the exit door, the cold air hitting them like a wall. Tires screeched in the distance. More gunshots. Tyler stumbled, his breath ragged. Keep going, he gasped. Don't stop. But Allison knew with a sick certainty that they were out of time. The icy air burned Allison's lungs as she sprinted through the alley. Her fingers locked around Tyler's wrist. Ramirez's shouts and the crack of gunfire echoed behind them, each shot like a knife slicing through her nerves. Her legs felt like lead, but fear kept her moving. Keep running, Tyler gasped, his breath ragged. They turned a corner, skidding on loose gravel. A rusty chain-link fence loomed ahead. A dead end. Allison's heart clenched. She spun around, her chest heaving, panic clawing at her throat. We're trapped, she cried. Tyler scanned the alley frantically. His eyes landed on a metal door set into the brick wall, paint peeling around the edges. He lunged for it, yanking the handle. It didn't budge. It's locked, he muttered, his voice desperate. Heavy footsteps pounded closer, the sound of their pursuers drawing near. Ramirez's voice carried from the distance. Allison, hold on. Her eyes darted to Tyler, who was frantically looking for another way out. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear and regret. She gritted her teeth, the weight of everything they'd endured crashing down on her. This had to end now. We can't keep running, she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. They're going to find us. Tyler turned to her, his eyes hollow. I'm so sorry, Allison, I never wanted this. His words sparked a fire inside her. She stepped forward, her voice cold. Sorry won't protect our children. Sorry won't fix what you've broken. Tears glistened in his eyes. I know. Then do something, she hissed. Stop running. Face them. A tremor ran through his body, and for a moment, she thought he might collapse under the weight of his choices. But then something shifted in his expression, a steely resolve she hadn't seen in years. He nodded. Okay, he whispered. I'll end this. The footsteps grew louder. The alley seemed to close in around them. Tyler took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He turned to Allison, his eyes softening. Take cover. I won't let them hurt you. No, she said fiercely. We do this together. Before he could argue, Ramirez burst into the alley, his gun drawn, his eyes flashing with urgency. Get down! Allison dropped to the ground, just as gunfire exploded. Bullets whizzed overhead, sparks flying off the metal fence. Tyler dove beside her, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Stay low, Ramirez shouted. More figures stormed into the alley. Vincent Marks's men, their eyes were cold, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Allison's heart pounded, but she refused to give in to fear. She grabbed a piece of broken brick. Her knuckles white, one of the men stepped forward, his gun trained on Tyler. You really thought you could get away with it, Brooks, he sneered. Tyler's jaw clenched. It's over, Marks. Let them go. I'll give you what you want. Vincent Marks emerged from the shadows, his face twisted in a sinister smile. He was impeccably dressed, his cold eyes glinting with malice. You always were a disappointment, Tyler, he drawled. You stole from me and now you think you can bargain, pathetic. Tyler stood slowly, his hands raised. I'll come with you. Just leave my family out of it. Marks laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Oh, you don't get to make demands. I want to see you suffer. And what better way than to take away everything you love?" "No," Allison shouted, standing despite the fear clawing at her. "You're not taking anything else from us." Marks's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing. "You're brave. Stupid, but brave." In that split second, Ramirez moved. He fired a shot, hitting one of Marks's men square in the shoulder. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the alley, the sound deafening. Allison ducked, grabbing Tyler's arm and pulling him behind a dumpster for cover. "We have to help Ramirez," she gasped. Tyler nodded, his face grim. He snatched a metal pipe from the ground, his knuckles white. "Stay close." They moved together, adrenaline surging through Allison's veins. Tyler swung the pipe, knocking a gun from one of Marks's men. Ramirez tackled another, wrestling him to the ground. Marks's eyes blazed with fury. He aimed his gun at Tyler, his hand steady. "This ends now." Time slowed. Allison's heart stopped. Without thinking, she lunged forward, slamming into Marks's arm. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the alley. Pain seared through her side, but she didn't stop. She clawed at Marks, her vision blurring. Tyler roared, wrenching the gun from Marks's hand and tossing it away. He pinned Marks to the ground, his chest heaving. For a moment, the urge to end it all flashed in his eyes, but then he looked at Allison, saw the pain and fear in her face. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't become like him." Tyler's hands shook, his breath ragged. Finally, he released Marks, his shoulders sagging. Ramirez rushed forward, slapping handcuffs on Marks and hauling him to his feet. "It's over," Ramirez said, his voice hard. Tyler turned to Allison, his eyes brimming with tears. "Are you okay?" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We're finally free." Tyler collapsed to his knees, his face crumpling. "I'm so sorry." She looked at him, the man who had caused so much pain. Forgiveness wasn't simple, but for the first time, it felt possible. "It's time to face the consequences." Ramirez nodded. "He will," as the sirens wailed in the distance. Allison felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The nightmare was over. She was free to rebuild, to heal, and this time, she wasn't afraid.